as we let folks come in. We are accepting questions tonight at the conclusion of the program. If you would like to ask a question, if you could enter it in your Q&A button, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We will be collecting those and entering as many of them as we can. Well, welcome. We're so glad to have all of you here tonight. I'm Nancy Stetz, and I manage education programs at James Monroe's Highland. We are delighted to be doing the program General Jackson, President Monroe, and the Florida Territory tonight in partnership with Andrew Jackson's The Hermitage in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, a little bit about how this program came to be. We're delighted to have Erin Adams with us tonight, who is the Director of Education at the Hermitage, and you'll be hearing a little bit more about her in just a moment. Highland was fortunate to open new exhibits this past September, and these exhibits, for the first time in site history, interpreted the building that you see here in the photograph as a guest house built during Monroe's presidency by two enslaved carpenters named Peter and George. Prior to 2016, we had thought this building to be part of the main house. So this is a really significant recuration to now have this building curated as it was as a guest house. And one of our exhibit goals was to really anchor this building in place. What was happening in Highland and the world historically, as the enslaved carpenters, Peter and George, were literally hammering nails into the wood to construct this building you're seeing. And so luckily, Monroe left us a rich paper trail to glean details from. And so one of the rooms in our new exhibits, which you're seeing here, does a bit of a deep dive into a letter Monroe wrote while home at Highland from DC one September day, September 6th of 1818. And, the letter is very, critical for our site understanding because it actually details this construction of this building, names the enslaved men who built it. But it tells us a lot about what's going on in current events. And about 3 pages of this 6-page letter are all basically Monroe wringing his hands about Andrew Jackson's recent invasion of Florida earlier in the summer of 1818. And so here within the red box, you're seeing 2 panels we have devoted to that aspect of the letter. And, almost immediately as we started staffing the exhibits, we noticed this was generating a lot of visitor interest, both in the situation in Florida and also Monroe and Jackson's personal relationship. So this seemed, just really ripe topic for doing more programming on. And so we were very excited that Erin was on board for delving into this topic with us tonight. And so a little bit about my co-host, Erin. Erin Adams has been the Director of Education at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage in Nashville since 2013. Erin believes her biggest priority is to advocate for each visitor, both as a guest and as a learner. Her department oversees K-12 learning, youth leadership training, and lifelong learning programs, as well as all guest services functions. While at the Hermitage, Erin has focused on making learning an interpersonal adventure between staff and visitors. Her academic interests lie in Jackson's Native American policies and practices. Erin has been a really great collaborator to work with, and I've learned a lot from her in working on this program. So briefly, before I turn it over to Erin, our goals tonight are, to kind of set up the context leading to this 1818 invasion of Florida by Jackson while Monroe was president. Kind of peer into the eye of the hurricane of all this chaos and look at the actual, letters and words exchanged between these two before Jackson was sent. What was actually said, what was implied, what meaning was taken. And then most importantly, to look with perspective about the impacts of acquiring Florida as United States territory with specific regard to indigenous tribes, American slavery, and more personally with the enslaved residents at both Highland and the Hermitage. And so with pleasure, I am going to turn it over to Erin.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you again to Nancy and to the folks at Highland for inviting us to go along in this endeavor. I have to echo Nancy's words. It really has been quite a learning opportunity for me as well. Florida and Jackson's actions in Florida, as well as his relationships surrounding Florida, have been a great area of research for me here just very recently. So all of that to say, I am learning about Jackson in Florida and his relationship with Monroe right alongside everybody else. So as we go through tonight, there will be an opportunity to put questions in the Q&A function, and those will get shared with us by our moderators and our host tonight. So go easy on me, because there is certainly many things for me still to learn. So when Nancy first introduced the idea of the project, she sent me the text of the panel that you're looking at here. And the first thing that struck me was the use of the adjective volatile to describe Andrew Jackson. Not that I objected to it, not that I felt it was inaccurate in any way. I just find that often people don't necessarily call it out so directly in that. And so it was quite humorous to me to see that, because I don't think there honestly is a better word that you could use to describe Andrew Jackson. In fact, later on in Jackson's presidency, he tells James Hamilton, he describes himself as born for a storm and a calm does not suit. And so if that doesn't express volatility, I don't know what does. And so it's interesting to watch that sort of demeanor here at play. So Nancy, if you are ready, if we want to advance the slides, I'm good. All right. Great. So there, Nancy had the wonderful idea to go ahead and lay out a timeline for kind of overlapping James Monroe's life with Andrew Jackson's. I think it's the perfect way to look at them. We so often think, at least from my perspective, we think of James Monroe so neatly packaged in with the Founding Fathers generation, right? He's in the portrait with Washington crossing the Delaware. James Monroe is the fifth president, right? So he's followed this great stream of those Founding Father generation presidents. And it's not till after Monroe, right? And then we sort of switch to those post-revolution, post-Founding Father presidents with John Quincy Adams, and of course Jackson coming very soon thereafter. But in examining the overlap between the lives of James Monroe and Andrew Jackson, I was really struck with a few things. One, Monroe and Jackson are only 9 years apart in their ages. Monroe was 18 at the time that is represented, of course, in the famous portrait here of Washington crossing the Delaware. It wasn't until the last year or so that I realized that the man holding the flag here behind Washington is Monroe. And so that was quite a new thought for me. But Jackson is 13 at this point, or at least by 1780. Jackson is 13 at this point. So Madison at this point would have been just, about 9 years older than that. But while Madison, in most people's eyes, would be of an average and acceptable age to serve as a combatant during the American Revolution, Andrew Jackson himself is serving as a combatant during the American Revolution. Now, he's 13 when this begins, and he joins the American Army on the example of his oldest brother, Hugh Jackson, who was killed at the Battle of Stono Ferry in 1779. Often we get the question, what in the world is a 13-year-old kid doing in a military situation in an army? What army would accept the services of a 13 or a 15 years old boy? Jackson is serving the American Army largely as a messenger, it seems, a courier. This is a kid who is on his home turf, right? This frontier of the Carolinas, this sort of backwater of British North America. And so here is Jackson fighting in a combat role, also serving in support capacities. Jackson himself is taken a prisoner of war at the age of 14, shortly after the Battle of Hanging Rock, which is an American victory. But he is taken prisoner by the British, which you see represented here in this very famous image from 100 years later called The Brave Boy of the Waxhaws. This is portraying Jackson about the age of 14. Jackson, in the course of his arrest, is confronted by this British soldier and asked to clean the officer's boots. Jackson rejects that command. He completely objects to this demand that the officer has made. Jackson, according to all the biographers, says, "I am your prisoner. You cannot compel me to do this." The officer clearly isn't taking that so well, goes to slash down at Jackson with that saber. Jackson throws up his left hand to protect himself. That saber comes down, cuts his left hand nearly in half. So Jackson is going to be left with very visible and very painful scars of the American Revolution, both internal and external. Jackson is then imprisoned as a 14-year-old boy along with his brother Robert. And so this makes Jackson the only president out of all 46 of or 45 of our presidents rather, who had served as a prisoner of war. It's a very unique experience in Jackson's life. And of course, that happens at the age of 14. By the age of 15, then at the end of the revolution, Jackson is completely orphaned. His mother, his father, his two older brothers have all been lost, and other members of his family as well. So emerging from the American Revolution, you see these two young men going in with a great deal of idealism, a great deal of patriotic fervor, a great sense of oughtness or rightness in the way things ought to be for the United States, that it should be its own endeavor. And because in my mind, they represent that bridge, if you will, between the revolutionary generation and the War of 1812 generation, that passion for the nation, the nation's future, the nation's security, is almost unmatched in another pairing that I can think of from their same sort of age range. So then as we move on from the revolution, we begin to watch the establishment of the nation. Then you have Jackson and Monroe, who are then both young enough to still heavily engage with the War of 1812 and old enough to come at it with a great deal more of strategy, with a great deal more of life experience behind them shaping this. Madison, of course, starts out as Secretary of War during that. Monroe starts out as Secretary of State during that period, moves into the Secretary of War position. Jackson is the Major General of the U.S. 7th Infantry during this point. So the communication between the two of these men is prominent. And as you can see here on the timeline, then they'll move. The War of 1812 for Jackson and Monroe both is going to just sort of continue on in a way into the first Seminole War, into the acquisition of Florida, and now they're serving in their original capacity, so to speak. Monroe went through the War of 1812 as a politician, as a federal servant. Jackson went into it as a military commander, and that relationship, those sort of understandings they have with one another as a result of this are just simply going to spill over into the Seminole War. And so we're going to see a lot of comparison, a lot of very similar and kind of expected results between what's going to happen between the two of them as we go through here. And then, of course, Monroe is operating as president right after the War of 1812. His term in office ends just as Jackson is running for his second season of candidacy in the election of 1828, and then of course dies within the first few years of Jackson's presidency himself. So we'll see as we go through over all of this tonight how these two men are going to line up in some fascinating ways. Nancy, if you want to go on forward with us. So as I mentioned, there's an old association between these two men. I tried to do a little research on the point at which Jackson first encounters Monroe. At what point do they actually first begin to know each other? And I couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but my guess is they begin to gather some familiarity with one another during Jackson's first term in Congress. Andrew Jackson was Tennessee's first congressman, first congressional representative, when Tennessee achieved statehood in 1796. Now, Madison, Monroe, I've got to stop doing this, Nancy. I know exactly who I'm talking about, I promise. But James Monroe is serving as an ambassador to Europe at this point. So they are familiar with one another, I feel, during this period. But of course, as we discussed, it's going to be that War of 1812 period that will bring them together quite strongly. So the two men are going to have a pretty frequent conversation, pretty much a running conversation between the two of them over the course of the War of 1812. Naturally, the concern for James Madison, who is president at this point, is the British and the British strategy. The British strategy certainly relies heavily on the involvement of Native nations, on developing alliances with Native nations, and trying to essentially encircle American expansion, right? We want to, or the British rather, want to try to sort of press in on the United States and be very clear about the expansion that the United States can expect. Canada is a key point in this. The United States has ambitions for expansion. Not only is the War of 1812 for the United States about defending what it has already achieved in the Revolution, but it's now also about making a statement that the United States' goal is to become an equal player on the world scene, just as Great Britain is, just as France is, just as Spain is. The United States is now asserting that it isn't just going to accept independence, it is going to strive for competitiveness on the world scene and take its place amongst the great powers of the world. And so while the attention for Madison and Monroe first is on Canada and the desire of the United States to acquire Canadian territory, they also have to consider the Southern territories as well. Largely, they're looking at disruptions and threats to the frontier that are posed by the Shawnee people, led by Tecumseh and his brother, the prophet Tenskwatawa, and the threat of the Muskogee Nation, or the Creek, as the British referred to them in Alabama and Georgia and Florida. So the War of 1812 is presenting a phenomenal opportunity for the growth of the United States if we can defeat not only the British, but these Native nations in the way as well. So Madison, Monroe, particularly Monroe and Jackson, are going to come to a pretty mutual understanding about what should be done, how it should be done, and what the expected outcomes are. And so there will be many instances throughout the War of 1812, we'll talk about a few, in which Jackson seems to constantly exceed whatever orders he has specifically been given by the commander-in-chief or by Monroe as the Secretary of War. But in each of these cases, Jackson's justification in his own mind, if you will, is that he's simply fulfilling the spirit of what is intended. So even without direct instructions to do things like invade Pensacola, Jackson is interpreting what he feels are Monroe's and Madison's intentions. And so we're going to see a great deal of that play out as we go through here today. So just a few items, a few images I decided to stick in here so we could review just a few facts about both of these men and their roles during the War of 1812. Again, Monroe, some of you may have a different thought, and again, this is a learning opportunity for me. But one of the things I think about with Monroe is that Monroe's the politician, right? He's the office holder. He is the logistics man. He's the man that's got to justify the actions of the government to the Congress. He's got to seek funding for these sorts of things. His job is to support the decisions of the president and the commander-in-chief. And Jackson is the man on the field, right? Jackson is the man out watching the play out of this. He is well aware of the sort of the lay of the land, both in terms of the support of Americans, the divisions of loyalties across the frontier, as well as the perceived threats and where strategically they may come to really play against the United States. It was a surprise to me to learn that Jackson was initially more interested in Canada and acquiring territories in Canada as far as the St. Lawrence River or the St. Lawrence Gulf. the idea that somehow the United States would go as far as the St. Lawrence, include the Great Lakes region, just is handing the United States this great bounty of natural resources that would make it almost unconquerable, if you will, that is going to go so far in advancing its economic abilities as well as its national strength and profile, its military presence in the world. So it was a surprise to me that Jackson was as so focused on Canada as he was. And so Jackson begins to let Madison, Monroe, and others, William Henry Harrison, know, hey, I'm here, send me. I am sitting here on top of the on top of the Tennessee militia. He is commissioned into the US 7th Infantry at this point. Send me, I'm here. And Madison, at least, sort of says thank you, and then does nothing to call on Jackson's services, right? He sort of keeps passing Jackson over for people that Madison feels like he can deal with a little more effectively, people like William Henry Harrison, for example. When Jackson sees this sort of almost pacification that he feels like he's receiving from James Madison, Jackson then begins to stop trying to reach out to Madison, and instead he reaches out directly to these other generals, William Henry Harrison, for example. And he notifies Harrison to let him know, hey, I'm here. The Tennessee militia is here. We are here to fight on behalf of the nation. Send us where you want us. And finally, James Monroe, for Jackson, represents this link now, right? That Jackson begins to cultivate this conversation with James Monroe in such a way that it begins to influence Madison's own thinking about Jackson at this point. And so really it's James Monroe in many ways who gets Jackson pulled into the thick of things in the War of 1812. Now, Madison is not going to direct Jackson to move towards Canada or to move to the Great Lakes region or the Ohio Valley. Instead, he is going to point him south against the Muskogee people and ultimately to Florida, to Alabama, to New Orleans, where the war is going to end at that point. I love the two portraits of these men here at this point because, again, it's showing them roughly the same age, the same position. And so it really, it kind of creates, I think, this wonderful visual reference point between the mover, the politician, and the mover, the general in the military force. Nancy, do you want to move us on just one more step? Thank you. So the War of 1812, of course, comes to this smashing conclusion. As Jackson moves against the Muskogee people of Alabama, he is going to defeat them roundly. And in addition to the military defeat of the Muskogee Nation, he also forces them to cede 23 million acres of land to the United States. And while Madison and Monroe had been watching this unfold, they'd been hearing reports. Jackson is sending reports back to Washington of his progress across Creek Nation. They're a little staggered by how Jackson is going at this, the brutality with which Jackson is taking to these native nations. The fact that Jackson is provoking a very intense civil war between the Creek members of the Creek Nation, between the White Stick faction and the Red Stick faction, or the upper faction and the lower faction. So Jackson is pulling on the Cherokee, the Choctaw, many who are going to later support Jackson at New Orleans. They are also fighting with him against the Creek. And the end result is the defeat of the Creek, the cession of 23 million acres of land, which is about 2/3 of the entire state of Alabama. It's also going to cause the Creek, though, to sort of withdraw and pull back from Alabama. They're largely going to flee towards the coast, kind of around the areas of Mobile and Pensacola. They're going to pull into Western Georgia, and they're going to pull back into Florida, which of course remains Spanish territory at this point. And you can see that on the map here. So at the conclusion of the War of 1812, this great defeat of Great Britain in 1812, the way I always explain this when I'm working with fourth graders is that this becomes the exclamation point to the end of the War of 1812 that Jackson is seeking to provide, that the nation is so eagerly wanting and anticipating. But here's what that is going to do ultimately. Thomas Jefferson had already purchased the Louisiana Territory by 1803, right? We're very familiar with this story, that it's essentially from Baton Rouge north, right? That parallel that runs here, and I'm going to annotate this on our screen so we can see it just a little more closely if I have the chance to do that. All right, great. So right here, what today would form the northern, it's part of the state of Mississippi today, but what ultimately extended provides the northern boundary of the state of Florida today. And I'm just going to extend that red line just a little bit. Ooh, straight line. Be looking at it as a straight line, friends. This is a problem. Okay, this boundary is a problem. So 1803, the boundary of Louisiana is sort of laid out here at Baton Rouge, okay? It goes along the Mississippi, and it's sort of this, what we think of as this sort of edge right here as the river curves. Because Florida has such a unique relationship with the European nations that have long been fighting over it, they're walking into Florida by 1817, everything has turned into this very swampy sort of jungle of entanglement, right? There's a great deal of international intrigue and a great deal of international maneuvering for how Florida gets divided and what its future holds for it. Okay, so to go back to the Louisiana Purchase, one of the issues that Nancy and I discussed in our earlier conversation was the fact that so few people realize, I think, and it's been my observation, that Florida was not part of the 13 colonies. The 13 colonies extend from Maine all the way down the coast of the Atlantic until you get to the southern boundary of Georgia. Why isn't Florida part of those 13, right? I think it's a natural assumption that people make. It was all the states on the Atlantic, it was all those colonies on the Atlantic, essentially the Atlantic edge of the nation were the 13 colonies. And yet people are often surprised that Florida was not amongst those. So by the Revolution, there's already a great deal of conflict in Florida, the British, the Spanish, the French, and then of course the Seminole, and then certainly British North America, and then eventually the United States. All of that is just going to continue to unroll until 1803, Jefferson purchases Louisiana. There's still debate and conversation over where the boundaries of Louisiana Territory are that are going to continue to provide these flash points of tension between foreign countries. And of course, this northern line that goes right here along the top of right where Baton Rouge is kind of intersecting that image there, is going to be one of the largest pieces of this argument. But 1812, by 1812, Louisiana is added as a state. 1815, Jackson is victorious at the Battle of New Orleans. And now we have, excuse me, trying to remove my annotations so I can move on from here. All right, so by 1815, by the victory at New Orleans, the map here is a wonderful way of seeing what those tensions provide, okay? So you can see sort of by your key here on your map, the gradual annexation of these various sections of Florida territory. So part of it begins to get annexed in 1810, but that annexation is still pretty bitterly argued between France and the United States. This is going to really begin a period of great tension between the United States and France, with which it has formerly had a very successful relationship. And so from that point forward, it's going to continue to be more problematic. As the United States continues to push into this region, gradually it's going to start pushing back and back this boundary of Florida. At one point, it only goes as far as the Pearl River. The next point, it's going to go as far as the Perdido River. And then it's going to go as far as the Apalachicola. And so by phases, all of this is going to continue to advance. So on the eve of the First Seminole War, which has got quite a range of dates associated with it, this is the territory that we're looking at in Florida. So in each of these areas, each area comes into the US with a great deal of conflict attached to it. And they don't bother to solve sort of the status of one part of this territory before they simply move along to the next one. So again, the issue here is getting more and more complicated as we go. Nancy, I think I'm ready for you to move on. Thank you. Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Erin. So as Erin, really clearly showed, it's very complicated. And when Monroe is president, there has been a lot of disgruntlement by U.S. citizens that the Seminoles in Florida have been doing these raids on the people living in Georgia and on Georgia plantations, and that's kind of what necessitates Monroe asking Jackson to go to Florida. And as Erin's shown, they've been down this road before. Monroe knows he's sending someone down there who's prone to exceed his orders. He certainly knows Jackson's personality. He's worked with him before. And so I thought it would be really interesting to kind of look at what was Jackson told, what is the actual correspondence, and then what actually happens, and we'll analyze that a little bit. So, and again, all this is happening kind of at the time with relevance to Highland that we have our extant building, and so it's very meaningful to our site interpretation. So John C. Calhoun was Monroe's Secretary of War. So this is the first quotation you're seeing is Monroe's War Department essentially giving Jackson orders to go to Florida. And Calhoun's wording is that you may be prepared to concentrate your forces and to adopt the necessary measures, bolding mine, to terminate a conflict which it has ever been the desire of the president from considerations of humanity to avoid, but which is now made necessary by their settled hostilities, there being the Seminole Indians. And so this can be distilled into please go and basically take care of the situation with the Seminoles. As Erin pointed out from further, older associations with wanting to acquire and grow United States territory, there's been a lot of previous conversations where Monroe doesn't necessarily have to spell things out. So then Monroe sent Jackson a follow-up letter 2 days later, telling him, this is not a time for you to think of repose. Great interests are at issue, and until our course is carried through triumphantly, you ought not to withdraw your active support from it. So as historian John Meacham put it, this is diplomatically oblique. It's a little different from just the terminated conflict message from John C. Calhoun and the War Department. And so where it gets continues to get interesting is Jackson's response. Jackson will write on January 6th of 1818 to Monroe. This is the most pertinent section of the letter. Essentially saying he kind of had his own ideas for this mission and said, this can be done without implicating the government. Let it be signified to me through any channel, say J. Ray, and he's mentioning this John Ray, who is a congressman from Tennessee, you see at the bottom of the screen, that the possession of the Floridas would be desirable to the United States, and in 60 days it will be accomplished. So here we have yet another angle of meaning here. Jackson kind of saying, here's my offer, just say the word. And some of you may notice that in Jackson's letter here, and some writing going the opposite direction from the original letter, is a note, which reads, Mr. J. Ray's letter in answer is burnt this 12th of April, 1818, A.J., which would imply that somehow John Ray gave him the tip-off to go to Florida and not only suppress the situation with the Seminoles, but to actually seize the entire area from the Spanish. This letter has never been found. The writing is not Jackson's. It's not really, there's a lot of mystery to be said to this communication, which we're not the first to delve into, nor will we be the last. So just take a moment to ponder, what were Jackson's instructions exactly?
That's right. That's
Because what he'll end up doing is, taking his militia to Florida. He will not only, make very strident warfare on the Seminoles, he will seize Spanish posts, This is essentially declaring war, or could be conceived as an act of war against Spain. He will end up executing some British subjects who he thought were inciting the Seminoles. And Erin, did you want to jump in?
I did. I wondered if we could go back very quickly to the map that we were just looking at with the kind of gradual advancements of Florida. What is really fascinating is that when you look at when you look at the map of the United States, like call it the map of the United States in your mind, okay? Like what it looks like today, the lower 48. So you're going to take essentially the entire state of Florida, okay? You're going to extend the panhandle of Florida and then think about how it begins to make this curve to the northwest, okay? So that curve is going to follow the south and southwestern boundaries of the Louisiana Territory, right? So it's going to look like it's going to look like you're starting sort of the Texas state line, and then it's going to go a little further north, perhaps up into Colorado, Wyoming, and then it's going to hit a straight line almost all the way to California, right? To almost all the way to Oregon Territory, okay? So if you're following that line, Florida eventually picks up a nickname, all right? It is referred to, and it's referred to by Jackson. Well, it's by one of Jackson's biographers who uses this expression, and it's wonderful. He describes Florida as a pistol aimed at the heart of the United States. That if we can't settle this little strip along the bottom, right? How can we possibly expect to make any advances further west, right? So there's this pistol, as he says, that's just aimed at the heart of the United States. And when you think about it, we often put so much emphasis on the strategic importance of New Orleans at the end, in the War of 1812, that it's where it unites the Mississippi with the Gulf of Mexico, the economic implications of the importance of holding New Orleans. But the truth is that there's so many competing goals for Florida, so many competing international interests in Florida, that if we can't resolve Florida, how can we possibly expect to move forward with any confidence as a nation that we can then do what needs to be done further west? So in many ways, Florida is already seen as sort of a proving ground, right? The War of 1812 gives the United States the mandate in many ways that it needs to move forward with Florida. But then, of course, as we're ready to fight the Seminole, now the issue, and we're going to talk about this just a little bit more as we go, the issue is also going to turn to slavery, as so many issues do in American history, because it is also part of the identity of Florida. And what message the status of Florida begins to send to the world around it. So we'll hit that in a moment. But I just remembered I had come across that quote, Nancy, and I wanted to share it. A pistol aimed at the heart of the United States. And I just think that is incredibly evocative. Yeah.
Yes, that I had not heard that, and I definitely think
right.
that encapsulates the feeling. So what is also really interesting is that this letter where Jackson says, I can take Florida in 60 days, Monroe never responds, and then later claims that he never read it till after Jackson invaded Florida. This letter from Monroe to John C. Calhoun, this is nearly a decade later. Monroe's retired. It's on the eve of Jackson's wanting to run for president in 1818. So this, as politics do, this has resurfaced. Monroe says, I never read that letter until after the affair was concluded, nor did I ever think of it until you recalled it to my recollection by an intimation of its contents. So it's definitely, it puts a whole other kink in the gears for Monroe to claim he never saw that letter, having already worked with Jackson and probably having some ability to anticipate what Jackson would say or do. And another aspect in this letter, Monroe writes to Calhoun that he did ask John Ray, as was mentioned in the previous letter, who was supposed to give Jackson a tip-off, in general conversation, whether he had ever intimated to General Jackson his opinion that the administration, had no objection to his making an attack on Pensacola. And Ray, declared that he never said that to Jackson. And Monroe kind of is tiptoeing around saying, I did not know if the general had written him to the same effect as he had to me, as I had not read my letter. He digs his heels in again, but that he might have led me innocently into a conversation in which, wishing to obtain Florida, I might have expressed a sentiment from which he might have drawn an inference. So
Yeah.
this is a bit of a tango here that amused me in researching their correspondence.
Yeah. And it's, Nancy, it's a tango that they have danced before, right? So during the War of 1812, right? No, October of 1814, Jackson invades Pensacola, deciding that the Spanish in Florida, as an ally of Great Britain, are funneling intelligence about American military force and movements into the British, which is accurate. So Jackson had drawn that. And then, so here goes Jackson marching into Pensacola. Madison and Monroe have given him no orders to do this, right? In fact, later Jackson sends a letter in which he writes a letter, before he does this in 1814, he writes to Madison and Monroe both, and he acknowledges, I am acting without the orders of the government in this case. And when that letter makes it to Washington, Madison is a little more put off by this event and this letter than Monroe is. Monroe, as this language in this letter to Calhoun would suggest, he's willing to put this in the realm of hypotheticals, right? Lots of mights and maybes, and he could have drawn an inference, right? But Madison and Monroe know exactly Jackson's nature. And so it's, in a way, it's almost the issue of like asking permission versus forgiveness, right? And so they're kind of willing to let him go. There is another, by way of comparison, there's this really wonderful story or account. It's called the Patriot War of West Florida, right? Or East Florida, I'm sorry. In which General Matthews marches in a force of just militiamen, kind of local men within Georgia and the Carolinas, right? That he gets sort of fired up that we are patriots. Our future is Florida. The fate of Florida means the fate of the United States. We must be ready to protect and assert the dominance of the United States' security and military forces. And so off he marches them into Florida. And Madison is horrified at what he has done, right? He has the man immediately replaced as a commander with General Edmund Gaines. What's the distinction between what Matthews marches into Florida and what Jackson is marching into Florida? Very little, very little. It's just that they already sort of know how to work with Jackson and they know what to expect out of Jackson and these outcomes. And so I think that's going to go a long way in many ways for Madison to be able to show discipline when you have military officers that are acting outside of the realm of command. But then Jackson gives them the result that allows them to say, well, sometimes it is worth it to us. And so, this is not an unprecedented moment, but I think it shows the power, if you will, that Jackson represents and kind of the abilities and just, again, the nature of the relationship between these men, particularly between Monroe and Jackson, because Monroe is going to go to bat for Jackson with Madison with this.
So there's a range of assessments on this communication situation that happened, but I really liked the kind of synopsis from Daniel Feller, who is at the Papers of Andrew Jackson, who summed it up saying the real issue is that Jackson thought he could, and Monroe did not correct him. Monroe did not give the tip off, but neither did he rebuke Jackson or relieve him on the spot. Instead, he either foolishly or cleverly misplaced his letter. So kind of a political maneuver potentially, maybe we'll never know. But there's a range of reactions to Jackson seizing Florida when he was somewhat exceeding his bounds. And I wanted to kind of foil together two different perspectives here. On the left side, you see an article from the Genius of Liberty, which is a Leesburg, Virginia paper, where we can see that while some people are horrified Jackson has done this, eventually it kind of comes around that it was just necessary. Major General Andrew Jackson has found it necessary to take possession of Pensacola. He has not been prompted to this measure from a wish to extend the territorial limits of the United States or from any unfriendly feeling on the part of the American Republic to the Spanish government. But here we get to the heart of it in the red square. Basically, it was the Seminoles that made this necessary. The Seminole Indians inhabiting the territories of Spain have for more than 2 years past visited our frontier settlers with all the horrors of savage massacre. Helpless women have been butchered and the cradles stained with blood of innocents. These atrocities, it was expected, would have easily attracted the attention of the Spanish government and faithful existing treaties that or speedy measures that would have been adopted for their suppression. So kind of this wasn't just trying to add an extra star to the flag. This was just it just happened, which is an interesting way of seeing this. Foil that against the history from the Seminole tribe on their own website. Their description of these events is that U.S. officials, angry that the Spaniards could not oust the English or control the Indians, were particularly incensed by the protection and shelter the Seminoles offered to African slaves, which doesn't even come up in the newspaper article. These freedom seekers had been finding refuge in Spanish Florida for over a century, but the new U.S. government was determined to stop this practice. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, conflicts, skirmishes, and ambushes erupted, and racial hatred flared into violence more and more frequently on the new frontier. And so, kind of moving into the longer term impacts, on the Seminoles, it was just decimating what this invasion started and then continued with the Indian Removal Act. On the Seminole Tribe of Florida website, they mentioned the 12,000 years that their people had been in the southeastern United States. Today, the population is less than 3,000 in a state of Florida which exceeds 14 million residents. And that is a credit to the almost 3,000, which the sentence next refers to, that have struggled to survive in Florida despite heavy odds. So we certainly see with the events of the Seminole War and Jackson's invasion, what is coming in the coming decades for the Seminoles and other indigenous tribes. I'm going to turn it back to Erin now, who will talk a little more about slavery into Florida once it becomes a U.S. acquisition, and just a little bit of an overview here.
Sure. I had intended to start this section with a different map image, and then I misplaced the image. There's another thing happening here too. Jackson's actions have not just been about Florida, right? It's not only about Florida. What Jackson is sent to accomplish in Florida is par for the course when it comes to slavery, when it comes to land acquisition, when it comes to Native peoples. So Jackson, as I mentioned earlier, at the end of the Creek War, forces the Muskogee to cede 23 million acres of land. It's basically 2/3 of the state of Alabama. Jackson is also heavily involved in forcing land cessions from the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cherokee. At this point, the Seminole are going to be kind of the end of this process. And when you map all of that out, Florida becomes sort of the last piece of what today is the southern United States, that is still dominated by Native peoples, unclaimed by the United States, and clearly fitting into this established example of the South as an agricultural region. Okay, so Florida for Jackson, in many ways, is representing kind of the end of a process. And all of these land acquisitions and land cessions are happening concurrently with the Seminole War, while Jackson himself is in Florida, and yet he's still very much involved in all the machinations that it takes to get this land ceded to the United States. When you add up all of the land cessions that Jackson is responsible for during this period, I mean, you're talking about tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of acres of land in what today is the southern United States. Now, often, and again, when I do this with children, one of the most natural questions for them is, what are we going to do with all this land? Why is Jackson working so hard to get all of this land? What's the point of it? The point of it is that the land is viewed as the future of the United States. The agricultural potential of this territory is critical in advancing the nation's economy and growing our economic profile in the eyes of the world. In order to do that, agriculture is going to take the largest share of the endeavors here, and agriculture is accompanied by slavery and enslavement. This language that Jackson is going to use during the Seminole War, certainly during his presidency, and when it comes to the writing of the Indian Removal Act, is that the duty of the United States is, and I'm paraphrasing, but the duty of the United States is essentially to take advantage of every resource to advance its own cause. And to have this land in the South, and that includes Florida, to have it occupied by people who are not acting in the interests of the United States advancement, they simply need to move. They need to go. Now, Jackson's going to find ways, along with Monroe and others, to couch this in a lot of national defense language, right? The Monroe Doctrine is going to come out very strongly. If we don't want European involvement in the affairs of the Americas, we have to be ready to dominate the Americas. And that means that full control of the land. Let's talk about how this applies, what slavery means in this particular case. Because the state of Florida, what today is the state of Florida, and certainly the territory of Florida, it is a very unique, I think, arrangement compared to what a lot, kind of the early history of slavery and enslavement in other parts of the United States. First of all, Florida is where slavery first enters British North America, right? Or it's where it enters North America, I should say that. That the first African slaves brought to North America happens under Spanish rule in 1526, about 1526. Estevancio was the man's name. It was a member of the de Narvaez expedition. I'm very sorry if you speak Spanish. I've just butchered that, I'm sure. The Catholic Church in Spain and the Spanish government had agreed that enslavement was a proper response to those people who had not been converted to the Catholic faith. Estevancio is kidnapped from his home in Morocco by the Portuguese, sold to the Spanish, and then brought to North America as part of this exploration expedition under de Narvaez, and he actually dies in New Mexico. Hernando De Soto, who so many of us are familiar with. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis is where Hernando De Soto dies. That's always been part of the sort of the mythology of the city of Memphis, is that, right, this is where Hernando De Soto dies. De Soto is bringing a sizable number of African descent slaves as well as indigenous people with him. It is the site of the first emancipation of enslaved peoples in North America. It happens in Florida. It's where the first settlement of freed Blacks in North America is happening. So there's many layers of this relationship between enslaved people, people of African descent, indigenous people in Florida, and then European powers. And then certainly one of the single largest drivers of the Seminole War and conflict in Florida is the presence of escaped American slaves seeking refuge amongst the Seminole. You may be familiar with the term Black Seminole. That was a term that began to get applied to people of African descent who had left the plantations in Georgia and the Carolinas primarily, but Alabama, Mississippi, and other areas as well are represented. And so they're adopted in as Black Seminole is often what they were called. Today, there are still descendant communities across Florida that link themselves to this Black Seminole identity. Jackson partly is in Florida to break up this practice, right? To prevent the loss of enslaved workers in the United States by them fleeing into Florida to return this property, as he sees it, to their owners in the states. And then certainly from 1821, at statehood and further, once the territory is acquired by the United States, then slavery is simply going to continue all the way through its identity with the Confederate States of America as well. But up until the point at which the United States has possession of Florida, there are significant differences in the way that slavery is going to be practiced between the European powers and the United States and Great Britain. And I'm going to lump Great Britain and the United States together for the purposes of this discussion. For the Spanish, they certainly do practice slavery in a chattel type situation, which the US and Great Britain do. But as I mentioned, the predominance of the Catholic religion also put some barriers around the practice of enslavement of indigenous and African descent peoples. That if somebody had been enslaved, brought to North America, converted to Catholicism, then there was to be a change, or it was assumed there was to be a change of some sort in the relationship between the slave owner and the enslaved person. Amongst the Seminole, slavery is practiced, but often as a condition of warfare. It's the situation, it's the way to handle captives in warfare. It's the way for people to settle debts or obligations amongst themselves. It is not intended to be a chattel form of slavery. It is not intended to be a race-based condition necessarily, and it is not intended to be an inherited condition. It is not meant to be a multi-generational system of bondage. And that is a complete 180, if you will, from the way the United States and Great Britain are going to look at slavery in the region too. I love the image that is on here. This photograph shows a slave market. It's the oldest slave market in Florida. This photo was taken about 1937, and it was still standing at that point, and its estimated build date was 1573, actually constructed by the royal decree of King Philip II of Spain. So slavery in Florida is a combination, or let me say it differently. Florida is a combination of many views about the enslavement of people. Everything from slaves should be enslaved until they make a religious conversion, or they should only be enslaved if their own personal actions have warranted their ownership by others, as in like debts, crimes committed, that sort of thing. And maybe it should have a race contingency to it. Maybe it should have a chattel contingency to it. So almost every way of looking at the application of the concepts of slavery as they're practiced around the world all find this intersection right here in Florida territory, that's going to cause, it's going to fuel the fires. It's going to continue to fuel these very arguments, right? Because the United States, of course, is going to start arguing the end of the practice of enslavement, the end of the international importation. Great Britain and Europe are starting to lead the way towards the abolishment of slavery and the emancipation, the universal emancipation of slaves. So all of those thoughts and ideas, all of that's going to feed into these arguments as well. So Nancy, if you'll go one more. And I'm seeing a few, sorry, go ahead.
No, so I think I was just looking at our time. I think we'll conclude with our two examples about how this directly impacts the enslaved residents of both the Highland and the Hermitage. So once Florida becomes, United States territory and we start seeing more plantations established there, this becomes an end to a means for Monroe. He finds himself in significant debt when he leaves office, and we see a retired Monroe writing to retired Madison that he has sold his slaves in that county, meaning Albemarle or Highland, to Colonel White of Florida, who will take them in families to that territory. And this is paying off a debt Monroe owed to John Jacob Astor that dated back to the War of 1812. And so we have an image, of Casa Bianca plantation that Colonel White establishes. It was primarily a cotton plantation where enslaved families from Highland will be sold in 1828. And one of our, long-term questions had been who were the names of the enslaved people sold there. And fortunately for us, we had two independent researchers really roll their sleeves up and tackle this question. And there is now an entire website called Take Them in Families, referencing that letter, that goes through these 17 people that we have identified that were sold there, as well as then their descendants, all the way into the 21st century. And here we see another panel from our exhibits where we play off that quote against one from Harriet Jacobs. But at the bottom, you see a photograph from our Council of Descendant Advisors. And to our, just enormous delight, there is now a member on that council that is a direct descendant from one of the enslaved families sold to Florida. So, we're really pleased to see, these events of the 19th century making a full circle in the 21st century. Yeah. And Erin has an example from the Hermitage that she's going to share.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to mention a man by the name of Hernando. Hernando has a really fascinating story. The document that you see there to the right side of your screen was a letter addressed to Andrew Jackson, as you can see, from a woman named Catalina Mir Sartorius, who lived in St. Augustine. Before Jackson enters the picture, Catalina Sartorius and her family owned slaves in St. Augustine. They lived in the St. Augustine area. And over time, Catalina's children began to immigrate to the United States. So they left Florida behind and they moved to Charleston, South Carolina. There was an enslaved man owned by the Sartorius family that goes to Charleston to live with John Sartorius, who's the son of Catalina. Fernando despises his life in Charleston, and I'm sure it's for all the reasons, right? It's enslavement. He does not want to be enslaved. He finds an opportunity to escape, and he does so. He goes back to Florida, but instead of going back to his original owner, to Catalina Sartorius, instead Fernando ends up falling in with this band of British provocateurs. Nancy referenced earlier Armbruster and Arbuthnot. I think I'm saying that correctly. These British agents that are at work across the Florida frontier, essentially provoking the people of the region, right? It's a lot of sort of guerrilla activity that's happening. Fernando falls in with this gang. He is involved in the destruction of property. He is, there's murders and physical violence that are caused. It's unclear whether Fernando himself is a murderer, but nevertheless, he's an associate of this group of men. When Jackson comes into St. Marks, Florida, and ends up arresting Armbruster and Arbuthnot and their colleagues and executing them without trial, Jackson doesn't even bother to put them on trial. He just executes them. This happens in Bowlegs Town, as it was called. And when you look at the map of Florida, you can see where I've marked it in a blue star, but this is where Bowlegs Town, as it was called, was located. And today it has been Alakua, I think, is the name of the community today. I can double check that. All of a sudden it's gone out of my head. But it's the Alakua. And you can see it's in the region of Florida called the Big Bend, right? So it's where the panhandle begins to then curve into the peninsula. So you have the Big Bend area of Florida here. The image of the Seminole man that you see is not Fernando. This is Billy Bowlegs himself, for whom this town is named. His family had been a multi-generational leadership of this community. Okay, so this is Bowlegs Town. Jackson arrives in St. Marks. He arrests Armbruster and Arbuthnot, executes them, executes some of their associates. As he continues, he's finding more of these gangs. They just happen to be, for the most prominent example, that people seem to remember throughout history. Fernando is a member of one of these gangs. When Jackson realizes that Fernando is an enslaved man owned by the Sartorius family of St. Augustine, Jackson does not have Fernando executed. Now, he doesn't do that because of the Sartoriuses. Jackson knows nothing about the Sartoriuses, but Fernando is enslaved and Jackson needs his services. Fernando was a blacksmith. He had worked as a carter and had a number of skills that were in demand by the U.S. Army at this point. And as the commanding officer of the U.S. infantry in this region, Jackson has the power to commandeer enslaved men to support the workings of the military. So Fernando was commandeered to the U.S. 7th Infantry. And this is in 1818, in the early part of 1818. When Jackson's time in Florida comes to an end in 1819, Jackson returns to Nashville, comes home to the Hermitage. Fernando is still with Jackson. And it's not clear why. It's unclear why he either doesn't go back to the Sartoriuses, why Jackson doesn't turn him over to the Sartoriuses. But in any case, he comes back to Nashville. Fernando is assigned a task to perform here at the Hermitage plantation. He marries another Jackson enslaved woman named Sally. They begin to have children. They have several children over the course of their life. 4 years later, 1823, Jackson has already completed his brief term as territorial governor of Florida. Jackson is now turning his sights a little more back towards national office. He's going to run for the Senate. He's looking ahead towards the presidential election of 1824. All of a sudden, there is a crisis over Fernando. Where does he belong? Does he belong in Florida? Is he owned by Jackson? Is he still owned by the Sartoriuses? Does the U.S. Army have a claim on Fernando? So there's this sort of legal entanglement, right, about where Fernando belongs. So Jackson, in order to just sort of cut through all of that entanglement, Jackson just purchases Fernando directly from Catalina Sartorius. And in the letter that you see, Sartorius, Miss Sartorius is responding to Jackson, and they're discussing the terms of the arrangement over this purchase. Catalina Sartorius is also providing Jackson with a message to pass on to Fernando, in which she's basically scolding Fernando for running away, and just reminding him that his new owner, Jackson, is going to rule with a little bit more of an iron fist than she herself and her family has done. And so Fernando needs to remember this. He needs to remember his place. He needs to remember who his master is and to serve him in an honorable way, right? So it's all this speech to Fernando. So here is Fernando living at the Hermitage, married to Sally. Fernando and Sally begin to have children. Jackson purchases Fernando so that his legal ownership is no longer in question. And then the first thing Jackson does is change Fernando's name. He changes it to Polydor. This is a question we often pose to our visitors, and it's a question we pose in a walking tour that we do about the enslaved here of the plantation. And that is, why would Jackson change Fernando's name? The man is a father and a husband. He is not a puppy from the pound, right? You don't get to change somebody's name just because you don't like the one they came with, right? That's the naming of somebody is a very personal, affair. And here's Jackson just changing it seemingly willy-nilly. The word Polydor is Greek, and it means multi-talented. You see the word Polydor or Polydorus used a lot throughout Greek and Roman literature. You see it in European naming customs. This is also, of course, a period in which enslaved men are often given by their owners these classical sounding names, right? You see lots of Pompeys and Catos show up in inventories of enslaved men during the period. So why is Jackson changing Polydor's name, and why does he change it to Polydor? The best that we have been able to determine from the research available is that what Fernando is doing in Florida is equal to what Jackson has executed other men over, right? Murder, property destruction, guerrilla violence, intelligence gathering and passing. What Jackson needs is a little plausible deniability. If somebody is to come back later, if there is to be some sort of international, furor later that Jackson is harboring a fugitive, right? A man who has wreaked havoc on the people of Spanish territory, it now gives Jackson that plausible deniability. I don't know who this Fernando is. My guy's name is Polydor, right? It gives Jackson a way to provide just enough margin of space between himself and Fernando's actions in Florida that it cannot come back to be a political albatross for Jackson. And so going into the 1824 election, here is Fernando with a new name, a new identity, and a new life, essentially. So for Fernando, representing kind of the status of enslaved people across Florida, they are going to be used as pawns. We know this. We know this from just the study of slavery in general, that enslaved people are often, that it is not uncommon for men of power to use slaves in these pawn-like roles in these moments. And for Fernando, Jackson has the right pawn when it comes later to defending his actions in Florida. So for Jackson, all of this is of a piece. International acquisition of international territory, the defense of the United States, the expansion of its economy, the enshrinement in the practice, the continuation of the institution of slavery, which Jackson never once is going to ever question in any way. Fernando becomes this sort of one man's bird's eye look, if you will, one man's microcosm about what all of these issues kind of come to a head for. There is a biography of Fernando that's currently in progress. It's being written by Jane Landers, who's a professor at Vanderbilt University here in Nashville. She is approaching retirement, so I'm very hopeful that that book is nearing its completion. But as soon as it is complete, you better believe I will be the first one on the Amazon pre-order list when that comes. Nancy. Oh, Nancy, you're still on mute.
Apologies. Thank you so much, Erin. I loved learning that story when we were sitting together and
Yeah.
talking about this. I see that we have run over, so apologies to everyone in the audience. And we're going to end just on this page. These were some sources Erin and I found really helpful on this topic. She particularly consulted Andrew Jackson in Florida. In my case, the Seminole Controversy Revisited in the Florida Historical Quarterly, as well as Tim McGrath's James Monroe A Life. He did a really fantastic job delving into this situation and really giving it life. So we highly recommend either of these three if you're interested in more reading. And if you are interested also in, stop sharing. I think we probably need to stop for the program tonight in terms of questions, but if you would like to have your questions answered, you do feel free to email us. I will put my email in the chat, Erin, if you would as well.
Thank you. Sometimes I
Yes.
get started talking and I find it hard to stop. So I do apologize for everybody who asked
All
questions.
good. I know we're I'm going to put my email in. Do feel free to send us any personal.
Are you putting yours in the chat, Nancy?
Questions? Yes.
Okay, very good.
We are so glad you came tonight. Thank you for delving into this topic with us, and we hope we'll see you again at the Hermitage, Highland, or online. So thank you for attending.
Thank you all so much.